Good morning. Welcome to warm and sunny Austin. Thank you for being here. We're pleased today to be announcing a new set of financial, technical, and sporting regulations for 2021 and beyond. And to lead us off, I'd like to turn it over to the president of the FIA, Todd, who is joining us by video conference.
Hi, Chase.
Hi, Jean. How are you?
I'm fine. So, shall I start?
Yep, we're ready to, yes, over to you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, I wish I could have been with you in Austin, but it was not possible. But I'm happy to join Chase, Ross, and Nicholas. I feel it's a very special day for our sport. It's kind of the conclusions of more than 2 years of intense work, research, development. And what is very pleasing is also the result of a close collaboration with our partners at Formula One. And today, we are really delighted to publish the sets of regulations which have been adopted unanimously by the World Motorsport Council, and it defines the future of Formula One from 2021 onwards. For the first time, the technical, sporting, and financial aspects address all at once. And the objective is to offer a more sustainable, safe, and exciting sport. First, with one innovative set of technical regulations. The cars should now be able to race more closely, which is something which was very important. And the action on the track should be more intense, with greater opportunities to attack and overtake. That's the whole idea. Secondly, the sporting regulations. Their goals is to make Formula One less complex and easier to understand. Third, for the first time in the history of Formula One, introduction of financial regulations. And on that, I must give a special credit to Chase Carey for his consistency in addressing that. I must confess, I was not sure, and I became sure, being convinced by him and by all the people who had the understanding on that. And the cost cap, means halting the growing spending gap between teams and the performance differential that naturally ensures. And through that, our goal is to have a closer championship and also being more unpredictable on the track. The first step on the road is also for a greater sporting equality, and through that we consider that the best compromise could be achieved. Of course, 175 million is still a high figure plus all the extras around, but we consider it as a first step. All that has been achieved thanks to, I was mentioning earlier, close work between Formula One Group, FIA, team, all the organizations, the 10 Formula One teams, the engine manufacturers, the drivers who have been associated to this exercise, circuit designers also, because we know that on the circuit there is a lot more we can achieve. And of course, with our tire supplier, Pirelli, who has been doing and with doing a very passionate and excellent work. So, again, thanks to everyone involved in this formulation of those regulations. And as I said earlier, it's a result of a truly collaborative effort, and I consider it is an achievement. For 2021, the regulations will be the best framework to benefit to competitors and to stakeholders, and ensuring an exciting future for Formula One. The teamwork has made it possible, and I really consider that it's a new chapter for Formula One which will take shape.
Thank you very much, Jean. As Jean said, this is an important day. Formula One is an incredible sport with a great history, heroes, and fans all over the world. We deeply respect the DNA of Formula One, which is a combination of great sporting competition, uniquely talented and courageous drivers, dedicated teams, and cutting-edge technology. We want to keep that vital DNA and evolve it to keep up to speed with a fast-changing world. This is why we need to improve the sport for the long term and make it more exciting and engaging for fans. The goal has always been to improve the competition and action on the track, and at the same time make the sport a healthier and attractive business for all. The unanimous approval of the rules by the World Motorsport Council is a watershed moment and will help deliver more exciting wheel-to-wheel racing for all our fans. As Jean said, the new rules have emerged from a detailed 2-year process of examining technical, sporting, and financial issues in order to develop a package of regulations. In the past, Formula One too often initiated random and knee-jerk changes without a larger vision. That is why we put in place an organization that was together with the FIA, capable of building a regulatory structure for long-term success of the sport, and then engaged in a transparent, constant dialogue with teams, drivers, and other stakeholders to define this set of regulations. The final regulations were never going to please all because there are too many different views and priorities. However, we all agreed on the goals, and our ultimate guiding light was what is best for Formula One and its fans. We made many changes during the process as we received input by the teams and other stakeholders, and we firmly believe we achieved the goals we had set out to deliver. We will have cars that are better able to battle on the track, a more balanced competition on the track, a sport where success is determined by more by how well a team spends its money, not how much it spends, including, for the first time, a fully enforceable cost cap in the FIA rules. A sport that is a better business for those participating and more attractive to potential new entrants. And a sport that continues to be the world's premier motor racing competition and the perfect showcase of cutting-edge technology. The regulations that have been approved will be married to a new governance and profit-sharing structure, which will enable the sport to grow and improve while further strengthening the business model. We're in an advanced stage of completing these agreements with the teams. These regulations are not a cure-all for all our issues. They're an important and major step. However, this is an ongoing process, and we'll continue to improve these regulations and take further steps to enable our sport to grow and achieve its full potential. One of the most important initiatives we'll be addressing as we go forward is the environmental impact of our sport. We already have the most efficient engine in the world, and in the next few weeks, we'll be launching plans to reduce and ultimately eliminate environmental impact of our sport and business. We've always been at the leading edge of the automobile industry, and we believe we can play a leadership role on this critical issue as well. Formula One is a great sport with 500 million fans around the world. This year we raced in 21 countries, and next year we will race for the first time in a fast-growing country like Vietnam and return to a historic venue, Zandvoort in the Netherlands. We have plans to grow our fan base not only through races, but through other initiatives and through the digital space as well. In the last couple of years, we've been encouraged by the growth in attendance, TV viewership, and digital engagement. This makes us ever more excited about the opportunity to build on that growth with these changes to deliver what is truly the greatest racing spectacle on the planet for our fans. In closing, I'd like to thank the leadership of Todd and the FIA and the partnership we created with them, my colleagues at Formula One that worked on these initiatives, and really, as Jean said, the teams, the drivers, everybody who had input into this process and enabled us to develop and complete these regulations. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ross and Nicholas to take you through the regulations in a more detailed way. Thank you.
Yes, I think, good morning. I think Chase and Jean have set out the principles of what we wanted to achieve with these changes. And I think it's to change the foundation of Formula One via the cost control, the governance, the basis of Formula One, and bring the teams closer together in more sustainable competition. And when they get closer together, we need cars that can race each other, because the cars we have now are terrible in that respect. We get constant reminders of the difficulties that drivers have of competing with another car when the performance difference is not huge. So we set out with those objectives. I think what has changed in the last few years is the new commercial rights owner, Liberty, recognized the need to do this and provided the resources and funds for Formula One and the FIA to work together to find solutions to challenges that Formula One face. We know it's not a one-stop shop. This is the first major stage, but the process will continue. If we look at the cost control regulations, they're completely new. They'll face many challenges over the next few years, but they're essential for the well-being of Formula One. And budgets have been escalating. Formula One is almost a victim of its own success in that the rewards of success in Formula One are so valuable, the justification for investment keeps coming. So I think we're providing a much stronger platform for the future, sustainable platform, and we're providing cars which we think are more attractive, can race each other. One small detail, for instance, every race we have, one or more cars fail to perform properly because they have bits fall off. As soon as they touch the grass, as soon as they touch each other, bits fall off and their performance is degraded. These cars have been designed to be much more robust, so we won't suffer those problems. So lots of factors have been taken into account with these new cars. And I'd like to ask Nicholas to take you through the detail of what we've done. And then I'll finish by taking you through an overview of the sporting regulation changes and the cost control regulations.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Trace. Thank you, President. I'll take you through a brief overview of the technical regulations. As you know, they've been published on the FIA website, so you can obviously read the regulations to the full length. First and foremost, I think I need to speak about aerodynamic regulations. Obviously, the part of the aerodynamic research that was carried out at Formula One with FIA involvement is the reduction of the wake to improve the performance of following cars when they're following a front car. And we've also seeked to simplify a bit the cars, the final shapes of the cars, and to desensitize some areas this way leading to lower performance differentials. So we hope these new aerodynamic regulations will mean that the difference between the fastest and the slowest car will be smaller than currently. We have simplified the front wing to create weaker vortices around it, and that's way giving less opportunity to the teams to control the wake of the front wheel. There's no barge boards anymore. Currently, the barge boards are massively complicated devices. You can see them on current cars. The car is fundamentally a ground effect car. It's got a long diffuser starting from the front of the sidepod, going underneath and finishing at the very back. So that is fundamental for the flow structures that we've seeked to achieve around it. And some areas of the car, not a huge number, are going to be prescribed because there are some areas where there's such sensitivity to control the wheel wakes that we feel that if we didn't actually restrict the shapes, we would end up with potentially teams finding ways to overcome the key objectives. So this graph shows you where we are at the moment. The black line at the bottom shows the loss of downforce of the following car compared to front car. So you see the x-axis is the number of car lengths. So when the following car in the current regulations is at 1 car length, it loses approximately half its downforce. And then obviously that carries on and gradually recovers the further away you go. The work we've done has brought these losses to the green curve. So we expect the following car at 1 car length to be at 86% of the front downforce. Clearly, when teams do their aero development, that number will reduce a bit, but we still expect there's going to be a huge chunk more performance for the following car compared to the front car even after the development of the teams. So all of that is fundamental to the studies that have been carried out, and the simulations show that it should achieve cars to be following each other much more closely and more able to attack the front car, which ultimately is what we are seeking. As you will be studying the regulations, the more enthusiastic of you will go into details, so I will give you a bit more content. The aerodynamic regulations are going to be much more CAD-based, computer-based than currently. So we've introduced an axis system, a coordinate XYZ system, and a lot of the legality of the cars will take place on the CAD. We will simultaneously be taking scans of the cars and comparing the scans to the CAD shapes in order to ensure that we are achieving the correct, the cars are legal in all the aspects of the regulations. So also all the aerodynamics of the car is covered by Article 3. Previously there's a few disperse areas of aerodynamics in other articles like the brake ducts and the brake system or whatever. Now everything has been brought into Article 3, which is the cornerstone of all aerodynamic regulations. There's been quite a lot of discussion about visual differentiation between the cars and shape differentiation. There was in the last month and a half some initiatives taken to increase a bit certain areas of differentiation. So we do expect there to be numerous areas where cars will look different to each other and can look different to each other. The nose, the front wing, the engine intake, the sidepod inlet, the sidepod shape itself, the rear wing. There's quite a lot of areas where we see still notable performance and visual differentiation. We have, of course, restricted some areas, as I said before, because there are some areas that are key to this wake performance, and we don't want to throw away that massive advantage that I showed you in that previous graph. So here's some images of what cars could look like, and I'm just going to flick back and forth a bit. These are all cars that are legal to the new regulations. So you see there's numerous features between those cars that I'm showing you that are different to each other. And clearly we're not suggesting that any car will look exactly like any one of those images, but we are suggesting that the rules do give the opportunity for these changes and differences to exist. And if you show you the same cars on front view, you see the side pod shape of the one car and the inlet of the engine. You see the diffuser, the fences under the diffuser. And you see how the same rules can produce different shapes on all of these areas. So we feel we've taken a huge step towards creating rules that still allow teams to be creative and aerodynamicists to be creative while achieving the key objectives that we discussed earlier. I will briefly take you through the rest of the rules. there will be a weight increase of the cars. Clearly, that's not a desired objective, but it is a consequence of largely the bigger wheels, but also some increase of the minimum weight of the engine. There's some increase of the weight of some of the prescribed components, and there's some reduction of weight of bodywork because it's a lot simpler in terms of shapes and construction. So overall, the weight of the car will increase, and also there's some safety improvements as well, which I'll talk about later. On the power unit, we largely are going to have a relatively carryover situation of the regulations. There's, as I mentioned before, an increased weight of the power unit. That is in order to enable the power unit manufacturers to save costs by simplifying some areas of the components. There will be some material restrictions. There will be some non-exclusivity clauses, so people cannot get a turbocharger from a supplier that's exclusive to that team. So in that way, we hope that we're going to reduce some of the costs to the power unit manufacturers. And there's also clearly an obligation for the power unit suppliers to give the same engine to the main team or customer teams that they are supplying. So the power units between all cars having a certain power, the power unit will be the same in spec and therefore in performance. On the fuel, we mentioned, of course, our key objectives for environmental sustainability. We've taken a step for 2021. The renewable content of the fuel is increasing to 20%, is doubling, but we know that's not enough yet. We are setting a fairly ambitious roadmap to increase that over the coming years, and in discussion with the power unit manufacturers and the fuel companies on how to achieve that. Going through roughly article by article of the regulations, chapter by chapter, rather, don't worry. We are going to have a much more prescribed or standard fuel system. That is largely for cost, but also for policing. We feel that it will enable us to have a much clearer view about that part of the power unit. So there will be a number of components in the fuel system that will be standard, and some that will be prescribed. At the end of my talk, I will explain the differences between the various parts in terms of their classification. Transmission, we have analyzed the costs that teams incur and have found that a large proportion of the cost is really the R&D that gets carried out from one year to the other for very marginal gains, and what we feel doesn't add anything to the sport. So we have created rules that freeze the transmission specification for a number of years. Teams will still be able to use their own designs and their own reliability and everything, but they will have to keep their transmission within certain volumes. In that way, we feel that the transmission as a performance differentiator between the cars will not play a significant role. Teams will have the right to change their transmission once in the period of the next 5 years, but we still believe that the rules are set in that way that there will be no significant advantage or disadvantage that any team will carry on a particular transmission. There's quite a lot of changes on the suspension. We are simplifying massively that area. We are banning the hydraulic suspension that we feel has no real relevance to road cars and is leading to ultra complicated systems. We are simplifying also the inboard part of the suspension in terms of springs and dampers. We are going to be banning inerters, which are don't actually bring anything to the sport. It's something everyone has, and it doesn't really create anything positive for us. We are simplifying a bit the kinematics. There will be the obligation that the outboard suspension points will be inside the volume of the wheel rim and not sticking outside, which we feel will simplify some of those areas. Clearly, we've talked a lot about 18-inch tires and wheels, and that is part of the whole suspension layout. We will be retaining tire blankets for at least 2021 and 2022. We will be making cost savings there by reducing the temperatures and the numbers of the tire blankets and the cost. We clearly are going to bigger brake discs because the wheel rims allow us to do that. We will be going to standard brakes. We aim to do that until 2023. We haven't done it right now, although it was one of our initial objectives because we felt we needed to be a bit more conservative on that front. On the chassis, we are creating larger internal dimensions to give a bit more equality between tall and shorter drivers. We are increasing the depth of the chassis on the side of the car to the beam is increasing in depth in order to improve the side stiffness and strength. There will be a prescribed floor under the chassis. What is currently the T-tray will be standard in order to avoid really a lot of fiddling around by the teams to gain an unfair advantage by managing to run the car another millimeter lower. And there's a number of safety improvements on the car. We will have better debris containment. There's a research that has led to a certain membrane being put in the carbon layup of certain key components so that when they do get in contact with another car, they don't all disintegrate in 1,000 really small pieces that get scattered on the track. We are increasing the front energy absorption of the nose cone. That is a longer nose, and we are massively strengthening the side of the chassis. We're improving the headrest and how it is attached onto the chassis. And we are also tethering some parts of the rear of the car so that if they are involved in an accident, they don't get fly around or get scattered on the track or even worse, fly into a spectator area. So we're doing quite a chunk of safety improvements. There's a number of material restrictions where we feel we're just trying to avoid exotic materials that are really equal for every manufacturer but incurring a large cost. And finally, I think this is an important slide. It's about the component classification. There's 5 categories. They're not all new, but that's how we've classified them. And it's clearly there's a certain number of components that each team needs to make. These are the LTC, the listed team components. There's a standard set of components. For example, wheel rims will be standard. Ultimately, brake discs will be standard, and things like tire blankets will be also standard. These are from a single supplier. We achieved to find who that supplier is with a tender process. There will be a number of prescribed components where the design will be owned by the FIA, but teams will be able to make these components themselves, but to a specific design. All of that is clearly for cost reduction. We will still allow certain components to be transferred between teams, such as the gearbox, for example. And there's a new category also called open source components. These are a set of components where teams will have to submit their design in a server, and a rival team can open the design of that component and make one of the same. These are not critical areas of the car. These are fairly small details that teams spend a lot of resource to redesign each year for maybe just a little packaging advantage or a little weight advantage. So we don't feel that we're altering any DNA aspect of Formula One by making these components more widely spread across the grid. There's a detailed list of all the components, their classification in Article 17. You can see if you open the technical regulations. That's pretty much all about technical. Clearly, if you have any more questions, I can answer, and I will pass on to Ross.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. On the sporting regulations, much less change than the technical regulations, but some clarifications to improve the clarity and consistency. I think the key changes are that the maximum number of races will increase to 25, but in correspondence with that, we're changing the format of the race weekend. Our promoters rely on a three-day race weekend, but we're changing the format of a Friday so that all the activities that sometimes take place on a Thursday will be condensed into a Friday. So, for instance, scrutineering will take place on a Friday morning, and there'll be 2 sessions, possibly shorter, on a Friday afternoon. And we'll still get the same, pretty close to the same amount of track time, but we'll make it more efficient. And the teams have been very cooperative on this process, and they've given us very strong feedback that most of them feel they can come to a race meeting at least one day later than they currently do. So that's been the objective. And over the race weekend, the number of working hours that the teams will be permitted to carry out will be reduced as well. So the curfew will be much stronger, and there'll be less available working hours for the teams to take the load off the personnel. I think the introduction of a reference specification is an important point. So when you turn up on a Friday, the car you scrutineer is the car you will race. You won't be able to put different pieces of bodywork or race different pieces of bodywork. You will on a Friday be able to try things. So if on a Friday you want to try a new front wing, you can do that, but you can't race it. And the idea behind that is to stop the proliferation or the necessity to build lots of parts in case that front wing works. In current Formula One, you want to take a new front wing to a track, you want to try it, you're concerned it may work well, and therefore you need to make 2 or 3 of them when you turn up at the track so both drivers can have it, and you've got a spare. Suddenly you've got a huge expense, and you're flying parts in at the last minute to satisfy that need. So there's some sensible housekeeping being done on the way we operate over a weekend to take a lot of strain off the teams. There'll be limitations on the number of dyno hours that the power unit manufacturers can do. There's a slope which is being agreed with the manufacturers to reduce the costs for the power unit manufacturers, and further reductions on the wind tunnel and CFD simulations. That's been one of the success stories of Formula One in the past few years, the aerodynamic restriction that's been placed on the teams as to how much time they can spend in the wind tunnel, how many CFD simulations they can do, and that will also have a further restriction in these new sporting regulations. And on that point, I'd just like to say that a lot of the comment that there's going to be a sort of massive rush in 2020 to work on this car before the cost cap comes in. I think we should all remember that the most fundamental change with this car is in the area of aerodynamics, and that's the area that's most controlled even within the existing regulations. So I think there's an exaggeration, if I may say, of what's going to happen next year with the new regulations and the effort the teams will put into it, because they can't. The ATR controls how much work they can do in the wind tunnel, and therefore they won't be able to exceed those limits and spend more time on this car. They'll have to balance that between their existing car and the new car as they do every year. So I don't see that next year is going to be that much different than previous years. Financial regulations are the big change, the dramatic change in Formula One. We've tried for these in the past and we've not been successful. I think the crucial thing about the financial regulations now is that they're part of the FIA regulations. So the sanctions from breaching financial regulations will be sporting penalties of some sort, depending on the severity of the breach. So whereas before, if any of you remember, we had the resource restriction, which was a gentleman's agreement between the teams. Well, there's not many gentlemen in the paddock, I'm afraid, and that was a failure. But this has teeth. If you fraudulently breach the financial regulations, you will be losing your championship. So it has serious consequences if teams breach these regulations. And they've been pretty well thought out, but they will need development, like any new regulation. I mean, even the current regulations, as you know, the current sporting and technical regulations are constantly in discussion. And this won't be any different. So I fully expect we're going to have challenges in the future to implement this, but it's absolutely essential for the good of Formula One that we have control on the finances and how much is spent in Formula One. So I won't go through the details, but there's a number of exclusions. We're excluding marketing, for instance. Non-Formula One activities aren't in there. We've tried to capture really the things that make the competitive difference between teams and the areas where they can spend money and gain competitive advantage. We've tried to control those areas. And we've got a very strong team of financial experts within the FIA and within Formula One, and we've sought outside support on this. Deloitte's have been involved with this. Deloitte's are one of the experts in sports finances. They've been very involved with the football world, and you can see the effect that's now starting to have on football, positive effect it's starting to have. And so we've had a very strong group of experts, and that will continue. We're not going to stand those people down. They're going to continue to help introduce these regulations and develop them. On the time scale, there is sort of a soft introduction in 2020. There'll be a requirement to submit your figures, but there won't be any penalties. But that during 2020, we'll be operating this system in order to iron out the bugs and sort out the problems. And but there'll be no penalty. Once we start 21, then any breach of the financial regulations will have a consequence. So I think they're very well thought through. I think it's a turning point in Formula One and one that we're all massively committed to. But it won't be a smooth road. There'll be things and challenges we'll have in the future, but it's an absolutely essential part for the future of Formula One.
A lot of information for us to digest there, but there must be questions from the floor. So please put your hand up and I will come over to you.
Peter Windsor, Clark Sport. Congratulations everybody involved in all of that. Ross, Ross I guess is the right person to ask. Two elements that to the layman seem to be relevant to a current Formula One car's inability to pass are the sheer size of the cars, they're massive by most standards, and secondly, the very short brake distance. Were there either of those two elements in your mind, i.e. perhaps going to cast iron brakes from carbon?
I think on those two elements, first of all, the size and the weight of the car. I mean, the weight of the car is not an attractive element of it, but it's a consequence of the safety and, to a large part, the hybrid power system we have, which I think is essential. So we did look at if there were any significant ways of reducing the weight of the car, and we haven't found any that wouldn't have been a massive reversal in where we are today. So in terms of braking distances and braking performance, it was taken into consideration. I mean, one of the things which we have built collectively in the last 2 years are a lot of simulation models, and Pat can elaborate on those for me. He knows much more about them than I do, but a lot of simulation models to understand how cars can race each other and what are the important elements for cars to be able to race each other. The thing that I think can be misleading is a number of overtakes. We have some tracks where there's a lot of overtaking, but there's no battles. And that's not what you want. You want cars that can battle and cars that can compete. And we've seen races where there's not been many overtakes, but great racing. So you mustn't just use a number of overtaking maneuvers as the measure. So there's been a lot of effort put into it. And brake distance was a factor, but I'm not sure it was a huge factor. And in fact, cast iron brakes aren't that bad in performance. They're just very heavy. So they're going the wrong way again in terms of performance. You got anything to add, Pat, on that?
No, I need to say that this is a process that isn't finished yet, and we will be looking forward. For example, with
Sorry, Pat.
For example, with brakes, we will be looking at carbon ceramic, not just for braking distances, but also the particulates that come off the brakes are something that concern us. So I think everyone should realise that today is not the end of the process. It's a waypoint.
Thank you, Pat. Next question, please stand. Thank you.
Hi, Mark Hughes, Motorsport Magazine. To Ross and Nicholas, in terms of the raceability, obviously the aerodynamics major factor in that, but also what seems to be equally, at least equally important, are the tyres. And has as much research been invested or will be invested in creating a raceable tyre? Because we've seen a few races this year where it's actually been really good. I was thinking of Silverstone, for example, and it seems to be temperature related, but quite random. How much research has gone into that, and how much will be available to that?
We are fully aware, of course, that tyres are equally important for races, and we've been researching this with Pirelli to a large extent. There's a new so-called target letter that has been agreed with Pirelli, setting out their key objectives of what they need to be achieving with the tyres. Clearly, that's not part of the regulations themselves, so therefore we're not announcing it today, but it's a work that's been going on in parallel with the regulations. I would also say that Pirelli are carrying out some fundamental research on the tyre constructions and the tyre compounds that should see some gains already for 2020 and should see some further gains, I believe, for 2021. So I think that's a parallel process together with all the technical regulations we've been discussing earlier.
Thank you, Nicholas. Next question.
Andrew Benson, BBC Sport. On the tyres, to follow that question up, are there any penalties for Pirelli if they don't succeed in achieving the targets in the new target letter? Because there's been no progress on this overheating issue for about, 9 years, basically.
I think it's a bit unfair to say there's been no progress. Cars have developed a lot more downforce and also heavier than before, and what tyres see as conditions is far greater than any loads they've seen before. There's been progress since last year to this year. We feel there's progress for next year, and the contract obliges Pirelli to use the best endeavors to make even further steps, which they're doing. So there's no penalties as such, but it is part of their contractual obligations that they need to be dedicating a significant amount of resource to do that, and it's for everybody's interest, including Pirelli's, to get the best possible job. I think there's quite a lot of good stuff happening there for next year and for the following year, so hopefully that will ease these concerns you're raising.
If I could just add a point on that. In fairness to Pirelli, I think they've had so many diverse inputs as to what's wanted. They've been struggling to have clarity on what they should focus on. And I think with the FIA and with the teams and drivers now, we've had a better process to try and identify what we should really be aiming for. Because for a long time, everyone was telling them we need tyres with high degradation, so we have lots of pit stops. And that created tyres which were fragile, thermally fragile, and the drivers couldn't push. And we've changed that objective now. We still want to have a reasonable number of pit stops, but we're changing the objectives for Pirelli, and we're trying to give them more clarity on what Formula One really needs, and I think they've been responding quite well.
Thank you. Next one.
Dieter Renken, Racing Lines. I guess this question is aimed at Ross. The International Sporting Code laid down a timeline for the introduction of these regulations, but it's a bit more flexible on the sporting and financial regulations. Can you foresee these changing between now and March, or even before the 2021 race?
Thank you for that one, Dieter. I can't, to be honest. I don't think they're going to fundamentally change. There'll be refinements. There has to be refinements, and there's refinements permitted within the International Sporting Code. But the new governance is close to being agreed between the FIA, Formula One and the teams. And I think when the new governance comes in, then that will take over and allow the development of the rules as they are now. So, but I think one of the crucial things about the governance going forward is we don't have the situation where we get blocked completely from any change in the future. The governance has to be a nicer and better balance of stability for the teams, but the ability to make developments when they're really essential. And I think one thing we should emphasize here is that priority for Formula One, the priority for the FIA is just to make the sport as great as possible. We don't have any other objectives. So our objectives are purely that. So when it comes to changes that are going to happen in the future, it's always with those principles in mind.
Thank you, Ross. Next one.
Michael Schmidt, Automotor and Sport. It's probably a question both to Jean, Todd, and one of the persons on the panel here. We've seen now the new rules, and now it's up to the teams to sign them. Is there a deadline for them to sign? How long can you wait? Do you have a plan B if some of them delay it? And how difficult or easy will it be then for new teams to come in?
I don't know what elements you're talking about, because I think the regulations are approved, so they don't require signing. They are approved. They're the regulations for the sport. I guess if you're talking about the governance and profit sharing components, which are, again, not regulatory per se, they're more agreements, with the teams. They don't have a specific deadline. You're right. Those will be what we put in place. Will be the rules for 2021. We'd like to get them finalized and signed as soon as possible. In fairness to the teams, while we've gone through all the material concepts with them, it's only in the last few weeks we've distributed the detailed agreements. So I think because these regulations had a hard date to be approved, which was the end of October, they've been more the focus from an agreement perspective. The teams in recent weeks have gotten the formal agreements, complete agreements relating to the other components. So we are looking to finalize those as soon as possible, but they will be the rules that are in place for 2021.
Thank you. Next one.
Final date, but
Jean, could you just start again, please? We didn't hear the start of your answer. Sorry, could you start again?
Okay. No, yes, I will. No, I said, as Chase said, there is no specific rules in terms of latest date for entering, but it's just a question of good sense. Everybody now, the regulations are quite clear. What is missing will come very shortly. All the things which needed to be known are known, and it's in the best interest of everybody to commit as soon as possible. I mean, the teams are employing hundreds of people. So, I mean, there are sponsors behind. So there are so many things behind that everybody needs to commit as soon as possible. I mean, to secure the good process of the 21 championship. So I will consider that the good sense will prevail and that we will be in the best condition to start the 2021 championship. And I mean, if it will not be the case, and it will be, of course, a possibility of opening the process for allowing new teams to come.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Chase. Next one.
Lawrence Edmondson, ESPN. Question to Nicholas and Ross. The cars are heavier. I assume there's going to be less downforce, certainly to start with. How much slower per lap are you expecting the cars to be?
We are expecting cars to be approximately between 3.5 seconds slower per lap. We don't think that is the key parameter of the spectacle. We feel that the raceability is the main target. We haven't been focusing on an exact level of performance. Clearly, we cannot predict exactly where the downforce will end up compared to current cars. It will be a bit less after the development has been carried out. But even the car that has been developed in CFD and run in the wind tunnel, this car has already got a respectable amount of performance, and it's been developed by essentially a relatively small number of aerodynamicists and hours in the wind tunnel compared to a normal team. Therefore, we are quite confident that the performance will not be a key parameter that will differentiate these cars to the current cars.
I think just to put that into perspective, that's the performance of a 2016 car. I mean, these cars, you remember from 16 to 17, had a huge increase in downforce. It's worth thinking back on that experience because it was done for reasons I don't understand. The huge increase in downforce was, let's make the cars go faster, that must make Formula 1 better. Well, all we've done is we've actually made it worse because the cars can't race each other. So it's an example of an unthought through program. And so the cars are very quick now, but they're not raceable. And the reality is the performance of these new cars is going to be about where we were in 16, which I don't think anyone was ever complaining about the cars being slow.
Thank you. Next one.
Dan Knutson, Auto Action and Speed Sport. Chase, as we increase to 25 races, we know you want more races here in the U.S. What other markets are you looking at?
First, we don't have a goal on it. This provides the ability to go to that number. That doesn't mean we have a plan to go to that number. We've said many times, quality is much more important to us than quantity. I think we only go to only add a race when we think the race really brings something special to the sport. We want to respect new markets. We want to respect historic markets. I think you look at this year, we're going to Vietnam, very excited. I think it'll be a great, it's, Southeast Asia, clearly an exciting place, for us to grow into. Asia, an important market. Vietnam, a very exciting country. I think it'll be a great track, great enthusiasm there. So I think that's an exciting addition. And marrying it to go back to Zandvoort, which is obviously an historic track, really, in the foundation of where our sport is. I think we like that balance of continuing to grow, in new markets and continuing to to find opportunities in historic markets. We are fortunate to have a great deal of interest today. We have interest essentially in every continent other than Antarctica. I guess Australia, I would say we're not going to probably add a second race in Australia, but we have a wide range of interest across the world. We evaluate each in its merits. The opportunity to add races, to add a new location, is limited. We value long-term partnerships. We just renewed a number of long-term partnerships, races in Silverstone and Monza in Mexico, places we've raced for quite a while. So I think we'll be thoughtful. We've talked about adding a race here in the U.S., so certainly that is something we've talked about for a while, and we are actively engaged in a couple opportunities here. We think the U.S. is an exciting growth opportunity, and as we've done more in areas like the digital world, we can see there's a lot more interest and a lot more fans here in the U.S. than people would expect, on the surface. So, we think there are opportunities like that. We did talk about Asia, obviously Vietnam adds a dimension to that, but each one's evaluated on its merits. And in some places, it's going to be adding a race. In some places, we value long-term partnerships, but we don't always have renewals. Obviously, this year we added 2, but dropped 1 market. So, there is probably limited churn. But again, our goal is to have long-term partnerships, but continue to pursue opportunities to grow the sport. But it's going to be, again, not trying to hit a target number. It's really 25 is not a target, and it shouldn't be taken as a target. What we're only going to do is add races, if we think it really brings something special to the sport. And we recognize, and was touched on when Nicholas and Ross talked, that find other ways to mitigate the pressures. This is a grueling sport to travel around the world with this many races and find ways, whether it's, through winter testing or practice during the seasons or the length of a weekend, find ways to try and help take some of the wear and tear off that exists, in the sport, as it operates today.
Christian Mehnert, motorsportmagazin.com. Question for you, Ross and Nicolas. When Formula One started to talk about the 2021 regulations, the engine was a really big talking point. Now it became clear that it's not a big talking point anymore. Could you clarify why it is? And you've also mentioned that the engine will stay more or less the same. Is it exactly the same, or are there some parameters like fuel flow or energy recovery that will change? Thank you.
So I'll answer the latter part first. The engine, in terms of these parameters you mentioned, fuel flow and these energy numbers, will remain the same. However, as I mentioned also earlier, the fuel specification is changing and is destined to change much more in a much bigger way over the coming years. The reason we kept the same engine in the end was also to do largely with the fact that what we have is the most efficient engine on the planet in terms of what percentage of the energy that is consumed as a fuel gets actually transmitted to the wheels is far more efficient than any other engine in the automotive industry. So we felt that any other change we would make would have taken a step backwards in that respect, and we felt it was the wrong direction to go.
I think one thing I'd comment on that area is it's true we did start with probably more ambitious plans to change the engine. In a way, I'm glad we didn't, because I think it's enabled us to change the focus. I mean, we've all seen in the last couple of years the increasing concerns about environmental impact of the things we do. And I think refocusing the engine suppliers on how we contribute to the solutions that we need to find for the future is a very important point. And I think all the manufacturers know that there's not a single answer to the needs of the future. So electric cars are one part of the solution, but also finding fuels which are sustainable, renewables that can also provide part of the solution. I mean, there's 1 billion fuel-powered cars on this planet, and we're not going to get rid of them in the next 2 years. So we have to find other solutions. And I think Formula One can be a really strong figurehead in terms of finding those solutions and promoting those solutions and publicizing those solutions, because there won't be one solution to the challenges we face. So in a way, I'm glad we didn't change engines that much, because we're now presenting the power unit suppliers with a new challenge, which is to provide solutions to that problem.
Thank you, Ross. Time is running away from us. We've got time for one last question.
Thank you. Dieter Inken, Racing Lines. I guess this question is to the President, but Ross, if you'd like to comment as well, please. Jean, Formula One has been attempting to introduce the financial regulations of cost cap for the last 10 years or so, and yet it was unanimously agreed by the WMSC, which includes Ferrari, and they were one of those who'd voiced opposition against it. How difficult has this entire financial regulations process actually been?
I mean, it has been a lengthy process, as I mentioned in my introduction, but the good sense has prevailed. We know that the global world is facing significant problems. So I think everybody has agreed, starting from the biggest teams, that it was time to change this trend of expenditure in motor racing, in Formula One, and that is what is happening at the moment. And I want to insist of a new challenge, as just Ross mentioned. We have some essential challenge to address. One of them is environment, pollution, climate change, and we need all together to put the strongest efforts to address that. And I see here amazing opportunity to demonstrate that Formula One not only being the pinnacle of motorsport, but could be also a leader in addressing problems in the environment.
I think I'd just add, Dieter, that all of the big teams wanted a cost control. You know, they recognize that for sustainability in the future, they needed it. They needed saving from themselves, because they were just trying to outgun each other, and budgets were going up every year. So they've all recognized that they need a cost control. It was just a question of how we applied it. That was the strong debate that's been going on, because they're all in slightly different circumstances. And we had to work hard to show them all that the system would be fair. But it will evolve. I don't pretend it's perfect now, but it's very good. And I think we'll now evolve it as we meet the different challenges.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that is all we have time for now. Our thanks to Jean Todd, Chase Carey, Nicholas Tombassis, and Ross Brawn.